Welcome, everybody. We are going to continue with the Unreal Games Fellowship for this year. I'm going to be your tour guide today. My name is Ryan Manning, and we're going to be covering the second installment of the sequencer event structures for game development. Let's go ahead and jump on in. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to do a very quick recap over some of the game development principles, specifically as they correlate to using sequencer and using the various functions of sequencer within video games and fun things that we can do with that. We're also going to go over just really quickly some of the sequencer core concepts. I know you guys had the previous lecture last week, so we'll try to do a quick refresher on some of the features, the tools, and then we're going to dive in and do a hands-on event where we're going to do a continuation of what you guys had started in the previous sequencer event structure course as well. So we'll continue that. We're going to do some gameplay activation, some player input action, trigger an event, and then finally we'll have some recommendations. For today's lecture, if you open up the same project, so that's going to be the SEQ_9050054, inside of that course content is the Sequence 205 maps, and there will be a Sequence 205 game dev. We'll jump to that as soon as we go through the brief highlight. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so what is game development? Something I think that's great to take away principally is, if you haven't worked with sequencer before, there may be a conception that you have with sequencers only for films, but that is not true. Fundamentally, Unreal Engine has always been a game engine, and sequencer is an extension of kind of those gaming tools. Now, granted, we absolutely can use it for film, but we can also do some really cool things for the gameplay experience, right? Pulling players into a cinematic experience, triggering things so we have control, etc. So some of the benefits, again, for using Unreal Engine for game development, not only can we build our worlds, we can do interactions, we can do player controls, we can give player guidance, progression, cut schemes, we can build that emotional intensity, right? We can lessen it, and there's a lot of other things that kind of go into this. And then additionally, one of the great things about Unreal is that we can build these experiences for high-end PCs, but then also adapt them for lower-end platforms such as consoles, handheld, the Switch, virtual reality, etc. This is an absolutely hyper-simplified production pipeline example. No game is ever the same. But a couple things that I want to highlight with this one is you'll see that there's various stages throughout game development, and if any of y'all have been in game development, you will also know that at any one of these little turning points, everything can flip itself on its head and change in a moment. All right, so why is that important? Well, from our pipeline perspective, right, there's more than likely we're going to have cutscenes or we're going to have some kind of scripted event that will be in the game, generally speaking. And the beautiful part about working within a real-time engine, and of course having the forethought to kind of think through building different systems for that, means that at any point we can adjust, we can flex, and we don't have to scrap the entire pipeline. At least that's the hope. The other thing that I do want to make note of is, which is going to be kind of counterintuitive to what we're doing here, but as we go through the exercise, it's going to be a lot of what we shouldn't do, which, to explain, within game development, right, there's going to be a lot of things that we may do very repetitively. So the exercise for today is not how you would want to do it in a production setting, but principally you're going to teach it. But if we think about, maybe the game starts with, one or two cutscenes because we want it to be cool. And then all of a sudden we realize like, hey, this is completely taken a narrative change and we want to start doing a lot more cinematics. Thankfully, we can do that. But again, the most important part here is to kind of think through some of those things and start building those systems early. But again, we'll dive into that as we get into it. All right, so let's review some of the core concepts for sequencer. Sequencer, in a nutshell, is a non-linear editor and assembly tool. One of the things that I definitely want to overly stress is, again, if you've worked with sequencer before, you have some idea about what it is, don't think about it as just a film creation, right? Now, while looking at this, if you've ever worked with a non-linear video editing, such as like Premiere Pro, or, DaVinci or any of those types of things, it looks very familiar, but there's a lot more that we can do with Sequencer. In fact, we'll see a little bit today where we can script some in-game events. And one of the nice things about using Sequencer is that it's completely controlled. So it's not just, hey, at random, I'm going to give an NPC a point to go to, hope he makes it, right? All of this is pre-scripted. We can control every motion. The other thing too that was covered in the intro class with this one is to understand that pretty much everything inside of Unreal can in some fashion be controlled through Sequencer. So it's not just limited to characters and audio. You can trigger effects, you can trigger events, you can move things, you can spawn things, you can do lighting, whole host of things that we can do with it. From the organization perspective, I think one of the things that's very important to take away from this particular slide is, again, Sequencer being that it's more filmic in nature, right? It's more akin to the film industry. That doesn't mean that you can't adopt some of those principles for game development. I hope and pray y'all don't take the YOLO approach and just start throwing things in folders, hoping that at some point you'll figure out the structure of it. So what you can kind of see on the right here is, adopting some kind, please adopt some kind of nomenclature, some kind of, prefixes, suffix, etc., that help to organize your folder structure, your shot structure, etc. I'll show it here in a couple slides. The reason for that is, again, if we take in consideration that game development can grow and get crazy as you're in it, it's important to set up those structures, set up that process, set up that organization early, so it doesn't come to bite you in the rear end at the end. So with this, again, this is a recommendation. We've got some links at the end of this slide as well to some white papers, some best practices. But fundamentally, you want to keep your shots, your sequences, and then kind of your main, we'll call it the film for lack of better terms. You want to keep those well organized and have a good structure. A couple other things that's important to note here is with Sequencer, we have the ability to leverage possessables and spawnables. And just real quick summary about that is a possessable is anything that's already inside of your level, inside of your world, that you can basically attach to, control, and puppet through Sequencer. Spawnables are things that don't even exist in your world. In fact, we have some of those in the run through that we'll do later here. But basically, spawnables are through Sequencer. You can basically have something come into the world for a moment, for the whole sequence, and then it's gone as soon as you're back into your main gameplay. This comes in very handy, especially if you're trying to trigger certain things. You'll see in the actual sequence that we've built, we also spawn some lights just to help with player direction, separation, and cinematics. But of course, once that sequence is done, they're gone. So possessables, spawnables. Going through some of the features again, just to quickly highlight Sequencer. I'm going to take a real quick sidestep here. So I'm going to jump over to our project. Don't worry, you guys don't have to follow along yet. And what I'm going to do is actually go up to my window, cinematics, and Sequencer. If anybody's done this and you think, oh no, my editor is broken, it is not. Okay, so when we open up Sequencer, I have mine docked here in the lower left. Just be aware that that window will appear blank until you actually load. So open up our level Sequencer till you actually load a sequence. And then again, another tip here. So you may be in your default viewport, you may be in cinematic, right? But if you start scrubbing your cinematic and you're like, hey, my camera's broken, just remember this little camera here to lock the viewport, and you'll see now you have your cinematic. All right, perfect. All right, so with the Sequencer features, again, just to really quickly highlight this. So on our main toolbar, we've got various different tools that we can use here, snapping functions. Probably one of the most important that you'll use quite often is this little, kind of looks like a small little sine wave here. That is the graph editor. If you're familiar with any type of animation program, animation software, this essentially is how you can control the interpolation, the speed of your keys. So you can ramp in, ramp out, change things to linear, etc. You do have some control inside of the main Sequencer window where you can right click on the keys. However, this gives you that really fine-tuned granular control over any of your keyframes. And then we also have, kind of on the right here as well, we have the breadcrumbs for that. So again, for today's lecture, for this whole kind of series in Sequencer, we're not using nested sequences. I absolutely highly recommend this, especially in full production. Biggest reason for that is the general assumption is that you probably have more than just one person working on your cinematics. So having that nested structure is going to allow multiple people to work on the same cinematic at the same time, as opposed to, which again, not inherently a bad thing, but in the case of like what we have on the screen, this is probably not how you want to work, where again, if audio needs to come in and animation needs to come in, well, only one can be working at the same time. So with it, if you're working in those nested sequences, you will have this breadcrumb up here, so you can actually go up a sequence, down a sequence without having to navigate to your content browser. On the left here, this is going to be all of our assembly. So this is going to be everything that's being controlled in that sequence or that shot. I think this was covered too. Fun fact, a shot, a nested sequence, they're actually the same object in Unreal. It's just how you use it that changes its function. But basically anything that you put in there, your content, that's going to be present in this side. Another button that you'll actually see as we go through the exercise today is there is this add button. In Unreal, there's usually a couple different ways that you can achieve the same result. So in our case, we're actually going to be adding one of our blueprints to the sequence, and you could just drag drop it if you want to, or you can use this add button at the top. Another fun thing here too, if you do start getting some crazy long, crazy bloated sequences, you can search, but there's also this fun little filter button here where you can isolate, say for example, skeletal meshes, static meshes, particles, whatever it is. You can use this little filter here to kind of just filter out everything else. And then finally, at the bottom here, we do have our playback control. So there's a couple things here where we can set our in point, which is the green bracket. We can set our out point, which is the red bracket. And then we can jump to front, go to our previous keyframe. We can jump back a frame, play in reverse, play forward, etc. We have all of this. And then we've, of course, got our timeline view here where we can scale it. So we can just drag these little handles and see everything within our sequence. A couple things here. So the event manager, we're actually going to be jumping into this in the exercise because we're going to be controlling some events. So we'll cover that when we get there. And this again is that curves editor window. So again, just to jump back, if you click this little button here with a little graph and a little sine wave, it will open up the curves editor window, which is a separate window. And here you can see in this particular case, we have one of our characters, and here are those joints and the keyframes that are on that. Quick note, not going to go too deep into this because we're not really editing keyframes today. There are a lot of good controls at the top of the curves editor window where you can do global scaling, stretching, you can isolate, you can stack your keys so it's easier to view. There's a fun little button here too for cleanup. So say for example, you have mocap data coming in. Fun fact, if you guys didn't know, you can actually do that cleanup directly in Editor. It's extremely quick and the results are actually pretty good. One other thing just to take a quick note of here, again, we don't have it for this course. There's pros and cons to this, but you have the ability within the main window here to actually do an add level sequence with shots. So if I just jump over to our project here in cinematics, add level sequence with shots, it's going to open up this little window. Now I'm not going to click it. I'll just explain it here. I would highly recommend, this is a great feature in the sense of it helps you to set up a structure that's consistent. However, I have found within a production setting that typically there's going to be some deviations or some type of thing that you're doing in your production that necessitates you don't really want to use this as a template because you'll have your own structure. However, again, if you're getting new and familiar with structure, this is a great tool. All you have to do is just add level sequence. You'll see here we can give names where the base path is going to be located, however many shots. So in this case, you can see 5 shots. You can duplicate sequences, you can add subsequences, go through, play with some of these, click create level sequence, and it will create a nested folder structure within your base path. And it's great. It's going to actually have these shots nested so you can see subsequences, etc. Again, if you've never played with this before, go in, just play with it, kind of see what it is, delete it at the end, keep it. But regardless, this is a great professional way to help organize your shots and your sequences. All right, and let's talk about cameras. All right, so obviously within video games, right, we have the unique ability, which is awesome and inherent to video games, where we are giving the player control of the camera, right? But at various times we want to take that control away because we're like that, we're overlords and we like that control. But something just to kind of keep in mind here is that, you know, within Unreal, we have two types of camera. So if you've seen this one, again, from the previous class here, this is going to be one of our cinema camera actors. And by nature, it's designed to mimic a real world cinematic camera. All right. So there's going to be things here with like film back, tracking, lenses, focus, right? It's going to give you that very rich kind of visual feeling. You can absolutely use it in games. However, we traditionally use more of this, I'm going to call it the basic camera, and basic in the sense of it just doesn't have as many functional controls, right? Like we can't do depth of field necessarily with out of the box with this basic one. But in a way we want that, right? Because in video games, we're looking at runtime performance. We're looking at, you know, achieving the maximum frames per second. So reducing any additional computations such as, you know, bokeh, depth of field, you know, tracking, etc. That's why we use this basic camera, okay? However, here's the big caveat with it. Within Sequencer, we can actually override that base camera and actually use a cinematic camera. So again, you think about something that's very narrative, story driven, you're probably going to want to use something that's nice, cinematic in nature. Totally fine. So the player will still have their control over their camera. We'll override it with a cinema camera and then go back to our basic camera. So just to kind of keep those in mind. One small note that if there's anything to take away from this, if you use a cinema camera, totally fine. If anybody's played a video game, I don't know, in the past, 5-6 years, right? And you're playing, and let's say that you're playing on an ultra wide, or you have a standard 16:9 ratio, and all of a sudden you jump to a cinematic cutscene and you have those lovely black bars on the side, right? Feels very amateur, feels very, okay, what's happening here? There is an option inside of the cinematic camera where you can turn off constrain aspect ratio. And what this will do is this will actually scale the frame to the player's monitor. So very, very important to think about here if you do that, right? So then you're going to get rid of those black bars, but absolutely test on different hardware. The reason being is that the way Unreal will scale it could actually clip some of your cinematics. So just keep that in mind if you don't like those black bars. Inside of the cinema camera actor, there is a constraint aspect ratio. Just turn that off and then obviously test it on your platforms. And of course, everything here should look fairly familiar from the previous class. Again, this is our cinema camera actors, all the different just cool, amazing things we can do. Sensor widths, focal stop, focal length f-stop, focusing, etc. One other note, I don't know if Kevin had covered this in last time. So on the cinema camera, you do have the ability to change post-processing settings. I will say this as a caveat, from a production workflow, I don't recommend using the post-processing on the cinema camera actor. Reason being is if you move that camera or you need to use a multicam shot, you're gonna have to copy those settings over. You're better to use a post-processing volume, which has literally the exact same settings, but is decoupled from your camera. All right. And then we've also got our camera cuts track. So inside of all of our shots, right, when we have an actual shot itself, a fun thing just to take note of is you can set the camera binding ID. So the camera that's in there, or if it spawns, sometimes it happens, sometimes it just loses its connection. Don't worry, you don't have to go recreate the shot. You can just simply click at the top here, so your actual camera cut, right click, and under properties, you'll see the camera binding, and you can bind the camera. So in this case, it's shot cam, which is inside of our sequence right here. Just keep that in mind in case you ever do have that decouple. You get a lovely red message, lovely red outline, and that's the way you do it. Right click on the shot, camera binding. Cool. And then just a couple other additional cameras that we have available to us. The scene capture component 2D. This one's used in various different methods for game development. A lot of times this can be, you can capture like an overhead for a mini map. Caveat here, it can be expensive, so be careful on this one. But essentially what it's going to do is capture something in your scene and render it to a texture, which can be projected, can be used for a whole host of things. I've actually seen this utilized, so for modern games and some cool things. I've seen an actual scene capture component 2D camera used to essentially take a snapshot with the Z depth of, say, for example, a city, and that's reprojected as a using Niagara particle system, and actually it looks like a virtual map of the city. Absolutely cool, brilliant. Cinema Capture Component 2D. So this is a new one. It's in beta. I think this came out in 5.3. Don't quote me on this one, but it is a fairly newer one as well. So similar in nature, but obviously we have a more controls that we have available. And then VCam Actor. I believe Kevin covered this in the last one too. There's some great things that you can use with VCam. In particular, you can use a iPad as basically like a virtual camera and control your camera inside of your sequence. Absolutely brilliant. We're not going to do that today. It works incredibly well. iOS devices are great. I know Android's coming out with some stuff, but VCam Actor basically it's a virtual camera actor that you can control with the Live Link. Perfect. All right, tools and enhancements. Again, we're going to cover this real quick because we're not doing this in today's class. Take Recorder, again, great tools. Whereas traditionally in the past, right, you'd have to have like a mocap set and you'd have to have multiple actors, and you could spend days doing shoots. Take Recorder is kind of a nice lightweight version. I mean, in fact, to the point where you can do a lot of capturing solo, multiple actors. In the example on here, so we have the two Meerkat control rigs here that we can animate. Obviously, we have different things that we can control. This little toggle here, so you can basically activate one of these, hit your little Take Recorder. It will record all of the actions. It'll actually generate an animation curve in a sequence. You could toggle this off, toggle on the second one, then record the animation, the motion, whatever it is of the second one, and then literally just stitch them together. So Take Recorder is great. Also record, obviously, anything that has controls. So you've got cameras, you've got skeletal meshes, etc. You can do that. LiveLink, MetaHuman Animator, again, just some great tools that if you do want to do something that is recording, you can do this on iOS devices. I don't think LiveLink is yet on Android. VCam is, but I don't think LiveLink is. Something that I definitely want to make note of here. While the examples in this slide are realistic humans, you absolutely don't have to use this for humans. In fact, you can do crazy, amazing creatures. It's pretty incredible. There's a lot of stuff out there. Again, you can probably just do a quick YouTube search on LiveLink Face, MetaHuman Animator. But a lot of things you can do with this. Just literally put it in the back of your brain as a teaser. Again, under the pretense that you're working on a game that has lots of cinematics and stuff, right? You don't want to necessarily be animating those all by hands. Use LiveLink. Works great. And then, of course, VCam as well. Fun note on this one, you can use things like a Switch, Nintendo Switch controller to essentially associate those with various cameras functions like zooming in, pushing out, focal lengths, etc. And then you can see on the right here, this is that interface on the iPad, which does display what you see in Editor, which is, again, if you haven't played with it, it's an absolute blast. And this here as well. Again, not going to cover it because we're not doing VCams today, but thankfully documentation is getting much better about how to set this up, how to run it, etc. This is a huge improvement. Previously, before 5.2, you only had, it was iOS or you had the other solution on Android that kind of worked, whereas now the Unreal VCam on Android has taken a major step forward. So you're no longer just limited to iOS devices, but I will caveat it with this. If you are considering using VCams in your workflow, I'm not an Apple fan. I'm not sponsored by Apple by any means. But one of the things I do want to point out is that the camera hardware on the iPads, particularly the Pro series, are really good because they have that depth sensor. Some iOS devices are good. Regardless if you go iOS or Android, make sure you've got a good depth sensing camera. That helps out a lot with tracking and smoothing and stability, so you don't have to do a lot of cleanup. So just keep that in mind. All right, cool. Now it's time to
Hey
dive in.
Ryan, if I could maybe pause you for this right now, we have a
Yeah.
couple of questions built up in chat. Wonder if we could address them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. So other Ryan is asking, how can I add morph targets to a sequencer track? For example, if I need to playback face capture data from live link captured with ARKit.
Yes. So when you record, like for example, from your take recorder, it will actually spit out a sequence. And inside of that sequence, you'll see it actually nested into a folder. There will actually be animation data. Okay. The important thing to note though is in your sequence. I think you guys covered this in the previous one, right? You have an animation track. That animation track actually be hooked up to something. So inside of your sequence, after you've captured that, you'll want to just add your actor into the sequence itself, and then underneath, obviously that actor, you can add the animation, and you can just drag that in there. So hopefully that makes sense. Add the actor, add the animation.
Awesome. I think Kevin answered a couple of other ones, but they were wondering about a combination of sequencer and UMG animations. Would it all be handled in Blueprint, or do they have their own timeline?
That's a great question. I can't necessarily speak to feature set wise right now in terms of if there's anything on the UMG side that's inbound. But UMG, obviously, that you can do controls. I mean, inherently, UMG is similar nature to Blueprint, that you have right events, you have scripted actions you can do. I don't know 100%. Kevin may be able to answer that one. I don't know if there's things that you can trigger via sequence into UMG. However, obviously, given the inherent nature of UMG, that you can still do various like call out functions. You'll see today when we kind of create this event, you can actually do event call outs from sequencer. At which point, again, not you wouldn't necessarily control your UMG within sequencer, but you could fire off different commands that can be intake processed and then UMG adjusted from that.
Yep, uh, that's exactly it. For the most part, UMG is triggered just like you're going to do today through sequencer from an event trigger. So you're going to learn that.
All right.
Animation wise, it's the same timeline inside, and it's just a smaller, dumbed down version of sequencer.
Cool.
I think lastly, someone just had some questions about recommendations. What are the very first steps to creating an intro animation?
I
Can
was
we take
typing up there.
the existing level we're working on, or shall we create a duplicate level and adapt it to our needs, or something else? So I guess some quick tips since we're going to be doing exercises as
Okay.
well.
Is the question be sure, maybe, no, yes, depends. I mean, really, it does depend. So one of the principles you're talking about there is, creating a level for an intro. The Man, like I got like 17 different solutions that might work for that. Here's what I would say. Fundamentally, it boils down to how much control do you want over that intro cinematic. If it's something that you want very tight control over, where you want it to look a certain way, and you guys are going in there and setting up lighting right, like very much like a traditional film. I absolutely would recommend you keep that separate. The reason being is, if you're setting up camera movements, character movements on a level that's being actively worked on, right? Who's to say environment team, design team doesn't come back and make some tweaks? Well, obviously they would make those for gameplay, but for cinematics, who cares? So I would say keep it separate. However, there are some various different setup functions that you can use. For example, like level streaming, you can use sub levels, etc. Where say that you do have like a big part of a world that is in game, but you also want to be able to use it for your cinematics. You could actually, for lack of a better term, stream it into your level, right? You could have a separate one for cinematics. So if they do make changes, you're not having to copy over, duplicate. But by having that separated, that level of separation, you can still modify and tweak and fully control your cinematics, but have that data streaming in, if that makes sense. I'm trying to think about some other
Spawnables.
What?
Spawnables. You can keep everything in the level, make a duplicate of whatever assets you want, add them to sequencer as its own level sequence, make them spawnable, then they only exist in that level sequence.
Yep. Another great one. So there's like a whole host of different tools and different like workflows that you could use, but fundamentally my recommendation would be if it has anything to do with cinematics that's not like a I'll use a simple one. Like Baldur's Gate is a good example where you probably wouldn't want to create a separate one, right? Because you want to use the level the player's in, right? If there's time of day, it just makes more sense to use it. But if you're talking about, like epic cinematic intro, Blizzard-esque quality, you'll probably want to have a separate level. So you have that full control.
Cool. I think one last one, maybe we'll keep it a bit high level. How do you handle blending gameplay to cinematics and cinematics gameplay to avoid some popping and make sure you have that seamless transition? Do you have a preferred process or method?
Great question. Great segue too. Is literally what I was going to go into next. So,
Right.
But was there?
No, I was like, that's exactly what we're about to do.
Yeah. So in terms of that flow between gameplay and cinematics, I will say this. It really depends on the emotion you're trying to sell within the game, right? Like if it's a hard cut where, okay, you immediately just basically remove player controls and you play a sequence, right? If your game, if that works for it, then you really don't have to do a whole lot of, systems building, if that makes sense. But if you're trying to do some interesting things where there's this nice flow, right? Like maybe the player is, walking and we walk up to a fence, and as soon as they get to the fence, right, it's very seamless where we kind of decouple the player's camera, a sequence takes over. You can still do that fundamentally the same way, but obviously you're going to want to have some different systems in there that, obviously takes player control away, will move the character, etc. If you guys recall early on, I said that we're going to be doing it in a way that I don't recommend, but we're doing it for this class. To further expand on what we're talking about here, what I mean by that is this, right? If we have sequences happening in game, traditionally speaking, there's going to be things that we're constantly doing all the time, right? Well, if I, create a sequence or I take over the player control, I probably want to flag the player to not take damage. So, because if we remove controls from them and, an enemy comes up, starts chewing on their, their ankle bone, right? We don't want them dying midway through the sequence. We may want to disable collision. So, if you guys have ever seen any of the Fallout takeouts where, the player just gets hurled off the map, various different things like that. Because we're doing those over and over and over again, my best recommendation, again, it's really outside of the scope of this one since this is a 200 level class, but you'd probably want to set up some type of external structure, whether it's a blueprint. C++ code will obviously run faster, but you'll want to take all that logic in there. So again, in the example you have here is, let's say that, okay, well, using my more complex example, right, player walks up to a fence and then we take over cinematic control. What we could do in that setup is basically when we start the sequence, again, exact same way we're going to be building it here, where, we'll script things, the thing opens, maybe a meteor comes crashing or they walk. That'll be in the sequence, but all of that logic that we want to take in, right, like decoupling the camera, disabling collision, disabling player input, we could essentially fire that off when we play the sequence to, think about it like a big master brain, where it's like, oh, that brain's just going to go ahead and control it. And when the sequence is done, fire another event, go ahead and regain control, etc. So that was like not high level, but that was kind of like into the weeds, but not too far into the weeds. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, biggest takeaway is what we're doing here is very linear, very just direct, but within an actual game, which again, we'd have to spend a couple days, if not a couple weeks, getting those systems set up. That would be my recommendation. Build your brain that's going to control all those things, and obviously crosstalk between the various different systems, and then sequence could just talk back and forth to that.
Perfect. That was a lot of questions. I'll let you continue for now, and we'll do another question pause later.
All right, sweet. So we're going to jump over to the project. So if you have the project open, I'm going to go to content browser. You'll see sequence 105 is what you guys were working out of last time. And then there's the sequence 205. And inside of maps, we should have this sequence 205 game dev. If you go ahead and open that, I'm actually just going to duplicate mine. So if it crashes, I don't override the basic one. So I'm just going to do this. There we go. Save. And then we'll get started. All right, cool. All right, so I'm actually gonna jump to the finish line here real fast. So if you guys have your map open, keep it there. The sequence completed. I'll show you essentially what we're building towards. So I'm just going to play inside of my viewport. Let this load. All right, so you can see we have our game control. We can run around, we can do whatever. We'll go to this platform. We'll trigger our cinematic. I'll let this play really quickly. And this is AAA quality level, just so you guys are aware, just setting that standard. Fun little thing here, you see we still have control. All right, so we'll have the player here. You'll see a little event fire here.
Sorry to interrupt you, but they're saying that it's hard to see the screen. Can you increase the scale to the 1.3?
I'll be honest with you, I have no
You can
idea.
hit Control Shift W as a shortcut. It should bring up the widget for increasing your text size.
Oh, you're talking like the font here?
Yes.
At the very yeah.
Oh, I gotcha. All right, we need to activate geriatric mode. Actually, no, it is not letting me do that. Okay. I will say this. Let me know if you guys really need it. I'll be honest with you. It's not super critical for this one. Be straightforward. So, do you want me to? You guys let me know.
Cool. Thanks for trying.
Okay. E for effort. All right. So hopefully that made sense. So again, just to recap real quick. So essentially what we have here is we'll start. You can run down. You'll go through this trigger box, which will trigger our sequence. The sequence will play up to a certain point, pause, wait for player input, and then we will press the P key, as in Papa, to continue playing. And then the sequence will end and we'll regain control of our game. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. So you guys should have that level open. So the first thing we want to do is add in our trigger box. So we'll do that through the place actors. We'll drop it in, and then we'll actually add a couple little kind of highlights here so that we have it. All right. So just go up to the platform. If you don't have your place actors tab on the side here, just go up to window, and you should have place actors here. And you can do search classes. Here's trigger box, or you can just type in trigger, and we're just going to take a trigger box. Okay. All right. So if you drag that into your main viewport, I'm going to kind of move some things here. And in your details panel, go ahead and just take the box extent to whatever you want. 120 actually works well. All right. And then before you click off, I'm just going to click off on my side. You'll see that the trigger box is very kind of a nice, cute little faint green line. We can actually change that. So in your line thickness, do something like 10 if you want to. And then in advanced, you can actually change your color. So whatever you like, something that's super pretty. I like pink. And there we go. So that way it's just a little bit easier to select. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause here because clearly you guys are also thinking in terms of bigger, better scaling games. What we did here with the trigger box, this is going to be a fundamental principle that we would want to use with our sequences, right? Like, because we want the player to trigger something. This is one of those situations where while we're using this basic trigger box, in an actual production setting, you'll more than likely create, you can do a blueprint. There's really not a whole lot of logic being processed on this. But this is a situation where this blueprint could be nested inside of, the trigger box could be nested inside of a blueprint. And then we could have various different controls, right? A good system would look something like, oh, I go to my blueprints and I have this, sequence trigger. And in there, in that blueprint would be, well, I'm going to give you a box and you can control the size. Maybe I'll have the sequence that you want to link up to it, and maybe a couple toggles of, okay, disable player collision, just disable player input, etc. Great example of that. Again, we're basic today. So, all right, so now we've got our trigger box built in. This is really all that we need. Again, shape, color, line, thickness should be good. One other note here is there's a question that comes up every so often is what actually triggers the trigger box? Well, it's the collision on the player. So if you go inside of your skeletal mesh, you'll see the collision boxes. Reason why that's important to take note of is, say for example, that the player has like, I don't know, some ridiculous Final Fantasy sword that's like 3 meters, 300 meters long. If it has collision on that and you're taking any input collision, right, the player could like move the sword through it and all of a sudden trigger a sequence. So just keep that in mind, that it's the collision volume, not the actual geometry pixels, that will trigger your trigger box, or at least I should say activate your trigger box. All right. Okay, this is where we're going to start kind of building all of our code out again. I don't recommend this, and you'll see why here in a second, but inside of the editor, you'll see up here this little, it's kind of little blueprint thing. There's this open level blueprint. The reason why, again, I don't recommend this, which again seems counterintuitive to what we're doing, is the level blueprint is code only specific to this level. So you can see that, in this one in particular, here's where we're doing our sequence play, disabling the trigger box, right? These are instructions that we will use over and over again in multiple levels. So if it's nested inside of the level blueprint, just know that, if we have a new level, I've got to take this code and copy it over to that level, and then another level, etc. The reason why we're doing it here today is, again, it's just much faster, but principally speaking, all the logic we're building, you would just decouple from the level blueprint, put it in its own separate blueprint, and then do all of your call out functions, etc. All right, so that's going to be our, so again, on here, we're going to do open level blueprint, which will open up our event graph. We'll get started there. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is, and just to explain real fast what we're doing here, it's very, very basic. So on actor begin overlap. So with our trigger box, when the actor overlaps, right? So when it triggers the box, we're going to do something. So in this case, we're actually going to play our sequence, which the target being a sequence player is that sequence inside of our level. Okay, and that's our basic first logic. And then we're going to disable collision. So we'll come back to that in a second. So we're going to go ahead and create this first one here. So we'll jump back into our level here. And what I can do just to make things really easy is I'm going to go over here. So here's my trigger box down at the bottom. As long as I have it selected in my outliner, so you can see they're selected, I can just right click in here, and you see here's this add event for trigger, collision, add on actor, begin overlap. So you see that does that. We'll double check we got that right. On actor, begin overlap for our trigger box. Pause there to make sure that everybody's got that. Again, the other thing too, so if you don't have it selected, so for example, I have a satellite dish, you'll see it doesn't do that. So just have it selected, right click, add event for trigger, collision, add on actor, begin overlap. Okay. All right, perfect. So next thing we're going to do is play. The target is a movie sequencer player, right? So here's the first thing. So if we drag our pin off of here and I just type in play, I'm going to type in sequence. You'll notice that I don't actually have the play here. And the reason for that is default is context sensitive. Context sensitive is essentially what it's doing here is it's reading whatever your input, so this incoming, so on actor begin overlap, what are the common things that are used for this? And that's what it's going to show you. So if we turn this off, you'll see we start getting a lot more things, okay? So we're going to turn off context sensitive, and again, the thing we're looking for is play. And it's going to say target is movie sequence player. So should just be our, drag off here, context sensitive, play, sequence, and we're just going to do this play. Okay, so it is play. Target is movie scene sequence player. All right, cool. Last thing we're going to do is actually just add our sequence 101, which should be in the level. I believe it should be here. If not, we'll go ahead and add it. So I'm going to go up to the top, do this. Okay, so it may not be in there, so let's go ahead and add that. I'm just going to move my blueprint off. This is something that was covered in the intro class. So you don't have to have the sequence inside of your level. The reason why we're putting it inside of our level for this exercise is because we're using the level blueprint. It's going to target the things in the level, hence why we need to have the sequence there, okay? So I'm gonna go to my content browser, and what we can use is, we're gonna go into 205, the SEQ folder. So again, that's gonna be in your content, courses, SEQ 205, SEQ folder, and there's this SEQ 205 start. We're just going to drag that in here and just put it somewhere nearby where we can actually hit it. Okay. All right. So with that selected, that sequence 205, I'm just going to right click in here, context sensitive C, and I do create a reference. Okay, so it's going to create my reference to the object in the level. Again, this is very prone to error. I don't recommend doing this, but for simplicity's sake, we'll do it, okay? Principle wise, we're gonna trigger something and we want to do this. All right, drag off of this pin and just do target, and you'll see Unreal is nice enough now to go ahead and just give us an automatic conversion node so that this target becomes what this needs. Cool, all right. Now if you're like me and you have a little bit of OCD and you hate when you see your noodles kind of all crooked, Fun little trick here, select the two, press Q as in Quebec, and we'll automatically just align them. But of course, you do all of them, it'll snap them in line, make you look like a pro. All right, let's go ahead and just hit compile and save. Move this off, and I'm gonna go ahead and just jump to my viewport. The hotkey is Alt-P for play, or you can hit P up here in the window. And let's just see what our stuff is doing, right? So here we go, we have our controls, we hit our trigger box, and bada bing, bada boom. All right, so we play our sequence. A couple things to note, I'm just gonna let it play real quick. Again, you can see that we still have player control, so I can move around, right? There I am, photobombing the, you see as soon as the sequence is done, character runs off, and hopefully it won't crash on me, and then we regain control. Okay, if you notice what just happened there, it started to play our sequence again. So I'm gonna zoom back over to here. The reason for that is if we go to our logic, right? On actor begin overlap, we're gonna play the sequence. Well, it's gonna keep firing this event every time we trigger our collision box. So that's gonna take us to our next step where we actually just need to disable the collision on the box, right? We want it to play once. Again, pausing for a second, pulling back the camera. Again, this is a situation where we're probably gonna do this over and over again with multiple sequences. So again, while we're putting the logic here manually, this is where we'd wanna put that into our logic brain in the game that would actually do all this for us. So, all right, so there's two ways that we can do this. Pick your flavor of choice, doesn't really matter. But there's two things that we can do here. So once this plays, our next setup is gonna just be disabling the collision on our trigger box. Or we can just destroy the actor, which in game is going to remove it, completely destroy it, so it doesn't happen again. Both ways technically will work just fine. I think if you're a Scorcher type of person, destroying it maybe seems like it's a little bit safer. Truth be told, it doesn't really matter. You can do which one. So, all right. So now what I'm going to do is go back into my viewport and just select my trigger box, which again we can select it from the outliner. Right click, create a reference to trigger box. Okay, and then the node that we're going to use here is set actor enable collision. Hopefully I'll get it right this time too. But if we do set actor enable collision, there's a couple collision ones. Here's why. There we go. Set actor enable collision, and then we'll drag off of our play here. Go ahead and automatically connect it. And you can see as it plays, goes here, it's going to, new actor enable collision means it's disabled. Okay, so that's option one. Fun thing again for the OCD folks in the room, you can double click on your noodle here and actually add a reroute node. Use something like this, maybe add a couple so your graph stays super pretty. One way to do it. Again, select, Q, add these, etc. Clean it up a little bit. So now if we compile and save, we're just going to double check real quick. Here we go. We're going to run. All right, we're going to trigger it. We'll let it play. We'll just double check. So it should be now that the sequence is playing. Should disable our collision. All right, our little guy will come up here. Then we'll run off. Regain control. And so now, perfect. So now we can continue running around, and obviously we can't re-trigger that sequence again. All right, perfect. And then just for edification, if you want to do the destroy actor, again, what we can do here is just drag off of this, type in destroy actor. That's another one too. So you can do that. Boom, purely optional. All right, we'll go ahead and hit save. And then let's just do a little bit of cleanup on this one. So what I'm gonna do is actually just highlight the top three, press C for comment, and I'm just gonna say play sequence. And you're not a true game dev if you work in light mode. You gotta work in dark mode. So I'm just gonna select my comment here, change the color to black, or if you wanna be special and have fun, change it to whatever color you want. Go black. You can see here I can move this. And then on here, I'm just gonna select my other guys, comment and say destroy ability to re-trigger cinematic. There we go. Changes. There we go. So now we kind of know what's happening. Perfect. File save. All right, perfect. So at this juncture, we've actually triggered our cinematic, which is great. It plays just fine. Now that may be totally fine for what you guys need, but we want to take this a step further. And again, pulling back the lens here for a little bit, absolutely would want to decouple this. You can do your event firing in sequence, totally fine, definitely recommend. But in terms of, player input and doing all those controls, again, you'd want those separate, because more than likely you'll have other systems involved with like key bindings, or maybe there's some like logic of, the characters talking, etc. Hence why you wouldn't want to put them in your blueprint or your level blueprint or the sequence. But again, exercise, totally fine. All right. So what are we going to do here? So in these next steps, we're going to give the player the ability to where inside of our sequence at frame 480, we're going to pause the sequence. Now we're not pausing the game, we're just pausing the sequence and giving the player the ability to basically input a key. In this case, again, we'll use the P key for play. You can use whatever you want, but basically we're asking the player to do some kind of input function. Okay. So the first thing that we need to do, because we need to have this logic stored somewhere, is we're literally just going to create a blueprint actor and use it for nothing more than just to be able to an event trigger. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my content browser here. And inside of the BP, we have one in there, BP Sequence Manager. Don't worry about that. Just right click, blueprint. We're essentially doing the same thing. And we're going to select the top one, actor. Again, I know this may be a little hard to see on screen. Select actor. Do a BP for good naming conventions. And then I'm just going to name mine SEQ for sequence and then MGR for manager. All right. I'll go ahead and double click it and open up that blueprint. Okay. All right. This is literally the only thing we're going to do with this blueprint. So we're going to create a new event dispatcher, and we're going to call it pause dispatcher. Technically, you can name it whatever you want, but it's fine. So inside of our blueprint window of our BP Sequence Manager is this event dispatcher. Click the little plus. This will create a new event dispatcher, and we will just name this pause dispatcher. I think is what we caused it, right? Pause dispatcher. Again, name it whatever you want. We'll be able to reference it later. It's fine. If you created it and you're like, oh no, I couldn't change the name of it, you can go over to here, the variable name, change it over here. Right. Hit compile, hit save. All right. So not to go too deep on this one, but essentially what we're doing here is this dispatcher is, easiest way to think about it is think about it like an old school telephone operator. The sequence is going to initiate a command to this BP Sequence Manager, and our dispatcher, right, our telephone say, oh, hey, by the way, incoming, there's an incoming event and I'm going to move this out to somewhere else or connect you to whoever. That's essentially what this is doing. The reason why we do this is through Sequencer, there's really not a great easy way to be able to fire a command from Sequencer to logic to create like player input, etc. So we use this blueprint basically as our container to do that. Again, many different ways that we can do this. I recommend inside of actual production, you do create a blueprint manager, something like this, right? Our big brain. But this is just very, very basic functionality. All right. So now we have our sequence manager. So let's jump over. We can go ahead and close that window. And I'll move this off screen. So we're going to go to our content browser, and then we're just going to drag the sequence manager into our level. Doesn't matter where you put it. Again, it's not going to do anything other than just be our container to, control things. All right, go ahead and hit save on my level. All right, perfect. All right, so now what we're going to do is actually add the sequence to our actual sequence is playing. So again, be careful here that whatever sequence you've added to the level, that's the one that we're actually controlling. So again, I drop mine here, do this. I can do open level sequence, which should open my sequence here. It doesn't matter. And what I'm going to do is you should have this events folder inside of that sequence. With the blueprint manager selected, what I can do is just add actor to sequence manager. So what I was talking about before. So we'll add that to that. The other thing is you could drag and drop it in here as well. Of course, it's already added. But we want to add this BP sequence manager to our sequence. Go ahead and hit save. Perfect. All right. So now is our chance to actually trigger this. So we're going to do an event. So on the actual BP sequence manager, we want to do an event trigger. So back over to here. So event sequence manager, click our little plus track, event, and trigger. Okay, so this will add a track. Again, very similar to anything that we do inside of Sequencer, where it'll create this new events track down below. Perfect. So as I said, what we want to do, so if I actually go back to our sequence here, just to explain, so I'll go ahead and do my camera. Right, our first shot is just, you know, setting the stage, you know, hey, here comes our little hero, heroine running in. We see them coming up to, oh, hey, here's the platform, recognizable. Our third shot is, you know, essentially this is, hey, it's my chance to dialogue with the character, okay? I do want to do just some, you know, some frames in the beginning so it's not just a hard cut. And then around 480 is actually where we're going to trigger this, and then you'll see, oh, the player runs off screen, right, and then it fades. Okay. So move your playhead to 480. Again, if you can't see it, if it's something like this, just drag out here. You can also down at the bottom here. So if I move my playhead here, I can go down here and just type in 480, and I'll immediately jump to my spot. Another fun fact here, if you want to, you can add a mark, which will add a marker. So if I move this off, right, and I could do something like take my marker and just say, you know, event trigger. This is purely just a organizational thing, has nothing to do. Of course, if I can type right, we'll use English here, right? Event trigger, you can use that. So 480, we'll go to there, and that's where we're going to create our event. All right. So to do that, we can right click, create a key, or we can double click. So I go back here, under my events, I'm at 480, click this little plus button, and now we get an event there. I'm gonna go ahead and just remove our marker so you can't see it, right? So there's our little keyframe. Go ahead and double click it, right? And that should open up this guy. So what I'm gonna do is, if you see this in here, the BP Sequencer Manager event, go ahead and just delete it, okay? Compile and save. Shouldn't be in there, but that's fine. So we should now see this actual custom event. That's what we created, right? We create this event. It's a custom event. If you've done anything with blueprints, this should look familiar, right? This is our custom event, okay? So we've created our key, and now we have this. So let me just recap real quick in case you guys missed that. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete this. I'm gonna delete my key. You guys don't do this. All right, so I'm gonna keep this right here. All right, so my BP Sequence Manager, I've got an event. I'm at 480. I'm going to create a new key and just simply double click it. And you can see it creates this new custom event. Just right there. All right, perfect. All right. So again, talking about why we have this BP Sequence Manager, it's a container. It's our dispatch, right? So this event, when it's fired, we want to call pause dispatcher. So I'm going to go over to here. I'm going to drag off of this. And if I do call pause dispatcher, it should pop up. It should also work if we just drag off of this. So I do pause dispatcher, there's call pause dispatcher, okay? And we'll do this, all right, compile and save. And again, all we're literally doing here is saying, hey, when this event fires, I'm just gonna send a call to our pause dispatcher, right? And our pause dispatcher is that blueprint, which is, again, just gonna be our telephone operator of sorts, okay? All right, so now we have that event. We can go ahead and close it. We should be good. All right. Moving on to actually triggering, right? Because if we were to play right now with all this, right? We know that our logic's being controlled in our level blueprint, right? We trigger the box, we play the sequence, we disable the collision or we destroy it, and that's it, right? But what we're trying to do here is create an input event for the player. Hey, I want you to press a key. So even though we have this, okay, we play, once we hit 480, we trigger an event, we're not really doing anything yet with it. So this is where we're gonna go in and add the rest of our logic, which is simply just to activate it. Here's a fun thing. If you guys aren't familiar with blueprints, don't worry. This is very, very basic. So we'll cover that, okay? All right, so inside of our level blueprints, if I just jump over to here, we're going to add a reference to this BP Sequencer Manager, okay? So I'm gonna go over here. I can just drag this in there and it will do it. So again, this is gonna be the BP Sequence Manager. Let me kind of expand this out. If you have it selected in your content browser, right, we can right click, create a reference, and there's our BP sequence manager. Okay. All right. We'll save that. Okay. So we're going to drag off this pin and we're going to do a bind event to pause dispatcher, which should look like this. So I'm going to go here, drag off, and I'm going to do bind event, and it may, there's bind event to pause dispatcher. Okay, there we go. Again, if you want to clean up your noodles, just press Q, compile. Okay, should have that. All right, and now what we're going to do is actually just add a custom event inside of this. So we're going to actually, what we can do is right click on this one or drag off, and we're going to do add custom event. Okay. So on our bind event to pause dispatcher, drag off of this. You see it should say add event, add custom event. There we go. We can give it a name, which in this case, we're just calling it sequence pause. The name doesn't really matter, to be honest. So we can select it, name, we'll just call this SEQ-PAUSE, and that should be our sequence pause. Okay. If you notice, I'm very diligent about constantly hitting compile. Take it, leave it. Reason I do that is just to make sure, again, that nothing is breaking as I'm going. If I'm midway in a logic chain, though, and I hit compile and it gives me errors, well, that's to kind of be expected. But checking every so often is good. All right, so we have our sequence manager. We are binding to an event, which is that pause dispatcher. We do a custom event. All right. So one of the things I want to put in here is just a print text. And this is simply just to give me a call out to say, hey, is my logic working, right? So if I grab this sequence pause and I drag off and I just do print, this is just going to be we'll do print text, right? And in my text, I can say, pause event triggered, okay? Triggered, ERED, there we go. You can span this out too. We can do print to screen. We can do duration. So for example, I may want this up on screen for 8 seconds, and that should be fine. We'll hit compile. One thing to note here is when it says development only, I'll highlight this over, but this has to do with the different builds, right? In video games, we create development builds so we can debug, we can unpack what's happening, run commands. We have debug builds, which are more for like a QA testing where it's limited functionality. And then we have shipping. So shipping is going to be what, the end players get to play. So anything that's marked as development or debug, anything in our code, that will be essentially stripped out. So what I mean by that is, let's say that I had, I don't know, I'll just put something here like a bus, right? During a debug or a development build, this will run. Otherwise, it'll basically just hop over it, is the easiest way to think about it. So with our print text, I'm just going to say pause event triggered. We'll do compile and save. I'm going to go ahead and just play this because it won't actually work, to be expected, but I'll show you. So I'll go back to here. I'll hit Alt-P just to play real quick. Let's run forward. Here's our guy. We'll trigger. And what we're going to look for is actually up in the upper left. Again, it's going to be super small text. We should see light blue color for 8 seconds says pause event triggered. So see if we get that again. That's going to be at our 480, and we shouldn't see anything. He should just run off. Yep, it's exactly what we expected. So go ahead and press escape. All right. The important part here to take note of is the way we currently have this set up is, well, there's actually not anything actually triggering this, right? We have just a sequence manager. We're binding an event. We created an event, but we're not actually doing that. So that's where we need to add this event begin play. So once we actually play the experience, we'll do that. So we can just drag back here and just type in begin play, event begin play, and now that should work. So we can move this, clean it up a little bit, compile and save. I'm not going to play it, but if you guys were curious, just you could go into level, play it. So now when we hit the sequence manager, when we have that event firing, it'll actually pop up on our screen saying, pause event triggered. Probably need to type better too. Pause event triggered. There we go. All right. So now let's actually do something with this. So we're going to take our sequence again from our level. So if I jump back over to here, I could just go up to here if I wanted to and just grab this guy and copy him. It's fine. It's the same. But essentially what we're doing is just grabbing our sequence manager, create a reference, or copy paste, and we should be fine. All right, so there's our sequence manager. And now what we're going to do is actually the functionality for this. So we want to pause the sequence player. So we look over to here, right? We can drag off of this. And because we are dragging off of our sequence, with context sensitive enabled, it's actually going to give me those things. If you recall at the beginning here, well, it should have. It should have popped it up, but here sequence player is, and we're going to do pause sequence. Actually, we're going to do pause. So I said too, there's sometimes there's multiples of these. So we're going to do pause, SEQ. Right here, I'm going to use the pause, not the pause sequence. Couple different things in there, but the one we want is pause. That's the more direct one. Pause sequence you see here calls the pause function on sequence player if it's valid. So we're just going to use pause. All right. Connect our sequence manager to the target. Of course. Let's see here real quick. 2 seconds. We're going to debug on the fly here. In persistent level. Why are you not pausing? Just double check. Target is movie sequence player. Target is movie sequence player. Drag into here. See if our target will work. Not compatible with BP. All right. 2 seconds. Oh, hold on. That's why. I dragged in the sequence manager. We don't want the sequence manager. If you actually listen to what I said, myself included, we needed the sequence. So I'm going to drag the sequence in here. There we go. Sequence to a 5 start. Now we're in business. Got to have the right actor selected. Okay. Now compile, get rid of our error. All right. Perfect. Okay. So our sequence manager, pause event triggered, and it should pause our movie. Let's just be diligent in our testing. Hit Alt-P to play. So now what we should have is, go here. I'm going to turn down the volume on that guy. There we go. All right, so now we should hit our 480. We should see our pop-up. Pause event triggered. We sit here. Perfect. Okay, all right. So our logic is working. So again, just to recap what we have here. So when we trigger, we play our sequence, we disable the collision on our actor, and inside of the sequence, so we open up our sequence real fast. Move this guy up, there we go. So at the 480 frame, right, we create an event and we fire this to that BP sequence manager. And in the BP sequence manager, we are essentially taking that, hey, an event has been fired. So we create our custom event, and what are we going to do with that? We're going to pause our movie player. So that's it. All right. So now let's add the rest of the information that we need, which is going to be our key to actually reactivate. So one of the fun nodes that we're going to use is a gate. So jump back over into our level sequence here. Drag off my pause. I'm going to type in gate. I'm going to create this gate. Okay. Now, what we want to do is actually move our pin to our toggle, and then I'll explain here in a second. So, pro tip: if you press Control and click, it will completely remove it. But if you hold down Alt, actually give you, or I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Control, hold and click will be able to move it. Alt will just delete it. All right. So again, holding down Control, I'm going to drag this pin. You can see I can take it to toggle. Right. So essentially what a gate is, I mean, think about it just like a gate on a fence. What it's going to do is it's going to give us different states, right? So if we toggle the gate to open, then it will continue the logic chain, or if we enter the gate, it can do something, or if it's in an open state or a closed state. These are very handy. We're just going to use it on a very, very basic level. And that is simply to allow us to use a key binding to basically trigger this gate. So jump back to our level blueprint, and I'm going to right click and I'm just going to type in, I believe the shortcut for this is just type in keyboard and then like your letter. So if you don't, you have to go through all this, like you have to, there's a lot of obviously key bindings you can do. So if you just type in keyboard and then whichever letter you want to use, just remember that letter. So I'm going to use the letter P, and you can see we can do pressed or released. We're just going to do pressed on enter, and then this is going to do our gate. All right. Another important thing to take note of here is that we have a Boolean here. So we're going to start closed. So that way, again, this logic, when it hits this gate, stops until we press it, then the gate's open, and we enter the gate, and we can continue moving. Okay. All right. So the last bit here was just we want to continue playing the movie sequence. So we go back here. We could drag off of this pin, but again, context sensitive, if it's on, may not necessarily have our sequence. So if I jump down to sequencer, you see it may not necessarily have everything we need, versus if I just drag off of our sequence player and I just type in play, it should pop up here. So this is that play sequence, which should be our, yep, it's just going to be our play, not play sequence. There we go, and then we'll drag up to our exit. Let's go ahead and tidy up a little bit. Hit compile to make sure this works. We'll double check our code. So we should be good. Of course, we're going to test it. So let's go back, and then I'm just going to highlight over these, hit C for comment, and I'm going to say pause event sequence manager, whatever you want to, just something where you, again, remember what it is. We got to go dark mode because we're true developers. Compile, save. There we go. All right, let's move this off. Same thing. I'm going to go ahead and just close my sequence. So we are fresh. Alt P for play. And there we go. So now we can run around. See if I can trigger. There we go. And what we're expecting, again, the character is going to run up in our sequence. At 480, we should see in the upper left our pause event called. Should pause our sequence. So there's our pause event triggered. It is, in fact, paused. The thing here to take note of, again, I made note of this, where we're not actually pausing the game. We are just pausing the sequence from playing. The reason for that is, again, if this actor were an actual actor that we were controlling, we could have them in an idle pose, right? We can still see the movement of the trees in the background, right? We still feel like we're enveloped in the experience, not I paused your game, okay? So now if I hit the P key, it should play in the sequence. And now if we run around, you see we have our control back again. Yay! Pat yourselves on the backs. You're now official programmers. You're Wonder Whiz. All right, cool. All right, so just some final recommendations. Again, we've kind of hit some of these as we've been going throughout. When it comes to organization, again, this is, I will say this is not an antiquated thought process. Sublevels still exist. However, you can't use sublevels if you're using old partition just because of the nature of the system. But this methodology is still very applicable. And again, the idea being, going back actually to the example we had earlier with, should you have separate levels? In this example you see here, we have a stage, we have foreground, we have effects, geometry, lighting, and P for persistent, which is counterintuitive because we have our persistent. Or let's just say it's for, I don't know, party mode. I don't know, something like that. The idea here being that you have these various levels. They're still levels, but they're nested on this persistent. So technically, with this structure, we have our persistent. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 people can simultaneously be working on this level at the same time, even if we're using revision control. Okay. And then how you name those sublevels, again, recommendation is just sit down, think through your methodology, think through your department. That's probably the easiest way. And then just determine what's going to work best for your workflow. And then, of course, the best naming conventions are the ones that actually make sense, not just random numbers and letters. For your content browser and folder structure, again, if you recall, if you haven't worked with sequences before, let me go and just close this out, right? Go ahead and just do one of these add level sequence with shots. This is going to be your templated one. This does a great job of just showing you various different naming conventions that are traditionally used in, again, film. I would recommend looking at film methodologies. They are very closely related in nature, and separating shots from sequences, from graduated masters to full film, can be very helpful. And the biggest reason is that when you start to dive into all of your sequences, right, if you've got a bunch of nested subsequences and they're just randomly thrown out, good luck, have fun on your scavenger hunt. We'll see you in a couple hours, okay? So definitely recommend that structure. Same thing within your outliner. It's the same recommendation, try to keep things fairly organized. If you're not organized, shame on you. It's fine. I don't judge too harshly, but I do feel the weight of it. Just be organized. It really helps everybody. And this is what I was talking to you about our nested subscene. So within your actual sequence, again, a nested subscene, a sequence, a shot, they're the exact same thing. What I mean by that is when we go into our content browser, right, and I right click and do cinematics, you'll see they're all a level sequence. Okay. There is no special thing for a subscene. It's really how you use those sequences that determines how it works. So again, animation track, VFX track, all of these guys, these are just separate sequences that when added to a sequence, they can actually be delineated as a subscene. Okay. All that to say, this is a great workflow again, because as you're working on a shot, right, we can have animation, VFX, our camera, our lighting, our sound folks, all of them can be working simultaneously on that same shot at the same time. Whereas if whatever was nested inside of these, right, so if we look at all these different tracks, if they were just on one sequence, well, whoever has that sequence checked out, they hold the power. Again, recommendation here is, if you know that this is going to be a part of your workflow and your sequence, sit down, write it down on paper, kind of figure out, okay, how do we want to break this up? Try to develop something that you'll be consistent with early on, as opposed to, changing your structure halfway through production. Workspace layouts is another good one. Again, this is just really from, if you've done, offline, or if you've done nonlinear editing before, you know that dual monitors is great. If you're stuck on a single monitor, that's fine. Just harp and complain to, whoever your boss is, tell them you can't be effective. It's fine, whatever. But there are some workflow, there are some layouts that you can do. Here's a fun fact, regardless of what you have. In your window, you can actually save your layouts. This does save as, I believe, in any file within your save folder. So you can take any of your layouts and actually move it to another PC. So if you have a very specific workflow you like, you don't have to go in, move the windows. You can just move that any file over and load it, which is great. Okay. Working in dual monitors definitely helps out a lot. Reason being here, so if I just jump forward a little bit, right hand side could be, I'm focused on my control, so I can, animate Manny here. I have my control rig. And then on my left hand screen, this is literally just, viewing my sequence, viewing my shots. It helps out a lot. Okay. And the same thing, because you can save the layout, have your, sequence for layout, and then you can go back to your, if, say for example, you're an artist or a level designer, you can go back to your, your level design, and you can flip between those really quickly. Some tips and tricks. You guys have access to the slides. I'll just leave it up for a second though. These are just various different shortcuts, keys to help you just, if you really want to be a speed demon inside a sequencer. These are great ways to do it. In Unreal, again, just a reminder, there's multiple ways you can get to the same conclusion, the same outcome, but these are just some really nice, handy shortcuts for you. And finally, an oldie but a goodie. The Fortnite white paper is actually really good. During the production of Fortnite, there was a lot of consideration for cinematics, right? Very cinematic driven, and all of it was done in real time. So if you're looking for a good read, definitely download this white paper, go through. There's still, even though I think this thing is probably 7-8 years old now, the principles contained in it are still 100% applicable to today. And then, of course, documentation online. Thankfully, with a lot of the upgrades and stuff, this documentation is getting deeper, more robust. So a lot of the things we covered today are inside of that documentation, and you can do that. Here's some of those links. Should be good. Perfect. Course evaluation, we don't have that. Again, I'm Ryan. I thank you guys for your time. I don't know, Caitlin, Kevin, I'll open it to you guys too. I think Nick as well. If there's any questions, happy to answer those now. But this technically will conclude. This will conclude today's webinar. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.